Good morning. This is Haley Solomon with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us this morning for our housing call. And without further ado, I will turn it over to our Director of Housing Policy, Stephanie Watkins-Cruz.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you all are having a great week so far. We are going to jump right in because we have a lot to talk about and we have a special guest today. So before I jump into that conversation, just want to give you a few updates from the North Carolina Housing Coalition. So we just wanted to highlight that we're bringing in some new sessions to our Bringing It Home conference, and there's 2 weeks left to register for that conference. But we're adding a mindfulness session as well as a Medicaid information session to this year's conference. Again, there's only 2 weeks left to register. The registration link is in the call notes, and you can check out more information about those new sessions at that same link as well. Also wanted to announce that our nominations for our North Carolina Housing Coalition Awards of 2024 are open. Each year, we recognize housing advocates across the state at our annual breakfast during the North Carolina Affordable Housing Conference. This year, it will be September 5th through the 6th. So if you or someone you know has gone above and beyond to advocate for affordable housing in North Carolina, nominate them today. The deadline to submit your nomination is July 26th. We also wanted to share that we have 2 VISTA, AmeriCorps VISTA positions opening up in our housing counseling network. So these 2 applications are open for the Cleveland County CBC and Prosperity Unlimited. They're each looking for a VISTA to grow their communications capacity. And you can learn more about each position on our jobs board, and we have that link in the call notes. Without further ado, I want to go ahead and jump into our conversation today with our special guest, Ms. Ashley Denise Scaff, or AD Scaff, from Legal Aid of North Carolina. She is a licensed clinical social worker and supervising attorney with Legal Aid of North Carolina. She's worked in mental health and advocacy for 12 years before becoming an attorney in 2019. And during her 4.5 years of legal aid, she has worked with the Disaster Relief Project and the Fair Housing Project in order to provide client-centered, zealous representation for residents of North Carolina. Working on both projects has allowed her to see the many barriers that are experienced by owners in heirs property as they try and maintain ownership of their land. And that's exactly why we have invited her to our housing call today. Welcome, AD. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You're going to go ahead and, I'm really excited to have you here. I really enjoyed reading the piece that the National Welcome Housing Coalition did on the settlement, that awesome victory that you all won. Can you give us a brief description of what heir property is, why it matters, but especially for disaster recovery efforts?
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna try to keep it, I'm trying to give it just a brief overview. So essentially, heirs property is a term used for communally owned / family land here in this country. And it becomes heirs property / family land when the original deed holder passes away without a valid will. And so then through North Carolina law, it then passes on to their heirs. And so sometimes that happens just one generation, and then sometimes that happens multiple generations. And, the reason people pass away without a valid will is there's certainly a lot of socioeconomic factors, but I would say sort of the historical factors, as most things sort of boil down to, is racism, keeping Black and brown families out of legal systems in order to take land and many other things. And so what that has created is this generationally owned land by families. And I'll say that this is a designation in our legal system, but communally owned property has existed before the country. It will continue to exist. But our current state of things that this creates a lot of issues. So why it matters, why this type of ownership matters, is that traditionally, in order to access like especially federal disaster assistance, but other federal types of assistance, including like USDA, you had to have your name like on the deed, right? So nobody feels like, a lot of people feel like if your name's not on the deed, then you're not like a true owner. And so this really came, I think, to a head, it seems like, after Hurricane Katrina, because there was a lot of heirs property and family property in Louisiana. And so a lot of people weren't able to access disaster assistance because their name wasn't on the deed. And so they didn't have that sort of traditional means of like showing ownership that these institutions wanted to see. And so they weren't able to get recovery assistance. And then, homes fall further into disrepair even after, whatever storm damage they had. And then, we see even more widespread gentrification, land grab, people in communities being displaced. So there was a lot of advocacy after that to change that. And we're starting to see a lot more institutions become more interested in this issue. And that's where it's sort of coming up. And I guess I don't want to run into, I think that's kind of in a nutshell sort of what it is and where we're like what we're seeing it in disaster recovery efforts. And then I would say, and then just like pure housing efforts, this is still an issue in that owners of heirs property are mostly kept out of traditional financial means of assistance. So like mortgages, home equity line of credit, those sorts of things, in order to like maintain their homes. So there's a lot of heirs property, and then it's all, people that are living on this land or owners in this land are kept out of maintain and repair their homes. That's in a nutshell.
No. Yeah, no, that was great. I think that's really important, and I appreciate you highlighting, giving us that additional context, especially going back to Katrina, because everyone, I think, a lot of people listening probably remembers, whether they were there or in surrounding communities or states, what it was like to kind of watch that unfold. And so to know about this and to realize that there's, this is generational impact that we're talking about, particularly when it comes to land ownership. But then also I appreciated that you connected it to affordable housing, because even without a disaster, the issue of heirs property can really impact people's access to wealth and other assistance. So we could talk about this all day, but I'd love for you to also tell us a bit more about the recent settlement and sort of, the lead up to the case and what does this outcome mean?
Okay, so the lead up, and I'll try not to go like too deep into the lead up, but essentially, okay, so Hurricane Katrina happens, and there's tons of advocacy, like lots of advocacy groups are talking about this issue, and then Hurricane Maria happens, which severely impacted Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico also has a lot of heirs and family-owned land, communally owned land. And so there's a lot of advocacy with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, about how they allow impacted communities to prove ownership. And so in September 2021, FEMA finally changed their ownership requirements as far as like the documentation. So if a person was unable to provide any of these like for traditional means of ownership, deed, etc., mortgage, that sort of thing, then bare minimum they could submit a self-attestation. So they could say under penalty of perjury that they are an owner of this property, and then that would allow them to receive the assistance. So that was a fantastic rule change. But what we saw is that the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Funds, those requirements had not changed. And so both the FEMA money and the CDBG money are governed through the Stafford Act. So we had this example that FEMA was able to take a less restrictive, documentation and still sort of meet their requirements, right? And so our question was, could we also accomplish that with the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Funds? Because I'm sure a lot of you know, like, FEMA only provides so much, right? And it rarely puts the person back to where they were. And really any financial assistance doesn't always put a person back to where they were, but FEMA's not going to totally get it. And so then you have this Community Development Block Grant Disaster Relief Funding. And here in North Carolina, it's through the Office of Recovery and Resilience, and that's the Rebuild NC program. And so they had changed, the program had relaxed some of their stuff, but it was still burdensome. So it was still that any person with heirs property had to contact all of the other heirs and get their consent to participate in the program, or they had to attest to not being able to locate them. And so we're all likely part of families. Families are messy. They just are. And so you have issues where maybe I do know where everybody is, but maybe somebody didn't get back to me or whatever. And so we looked at the data, and there's tons of research showing that heirs property is more disproportionately owned by, especially in the Southeast, by Black landowners. And so we came at this from a fair housing angle, and that this was a housing provider that was placing a more burdensome requirement on Black landowners for them that were otherwise eligible in order for them to access this assistance. And so that's what led us to the complaint with HUD under the Fair Housing Act. And so it took a bit of back and forth. There's a lot of discussions. So part of a HUD complaint, they're investigating the complaint, but also you're working through and attempting to conciliate or reach a settlement. And so in about October-ish, we finally reached some common ground with the Office of Recovery and Resiliency, and then it took a few more months to kind of iron everything out. But we're really, really excited. We're so glad that the Office of Recovery and Resiliency was willing to hear us out and have those conciliation meetings and sort of talk about what their concerns were and allow us to also address those concerns so that we could come to some common ground. And so what this means is that for North Carolina, owners of heirs property don't have to get this affirmative statement from all other heirs and try to locate everyone, and they're allowed to just notify people of their participation, and they get to notify them in whatever means they think is the best way to do, the most appropriate, which again, thinking about families as a system, they can be messy, but so they get to decide what works best for their family and letting them know that they're doing this. And it allows them to improve the property, which they're already allowed to do, which was one thing that we had to kind of address, and continue living on the land and keeping it improved, keeping the property values up. And our hope is that because this is federal funds, that other states will be able to use this as a blueprint to change the rule across the country. We've got Hawaii is likely coming up on their Community Development Block Grant funding soon, and they also have a lot of communally owned properties. And so we're hoping that, this will have some broad impact. And hopefully we can push it a little further and keep moving that goal a little bit to allow, owners and heirs property to access all of these things so that they can keep their land. I think I'll just say that I think in our research, one thing that we've seen is that a lot of approaches to heirs property is how to fix the heirs property so that it fits into these systems. And I think our approach was to think about how we could change the system to respect the nature of the ownership instead of changing it. And for anyone listening, if you are in a position to do that, we think it is good, because, you know, not everything fits for every family, and we want to make sure that they can maintain that land in the best way that works for their family.
Yeah.
I think that's...
And I think, you know, speaking of moving it forward, what would you say are some additional policy changes, you know, thinking of what additional room we have to go, right? What is still the journey to come, the journey that's needed? What are some additional policy changes that you think we need in order to improve these situations? I like how you mentioned addressing it not in terms of forcing folks to fit into the system, but, you know, kind of more of that people-centered solution. But what would you say are some additional policy changes, and what should advocates or interested parties kind of be aware of?
So as an employee of a legal services corporation, I can't lobby for specific changes, but I can say that, like I was saying, you know, thinking about like how the systems can't change to respect the nature of this type of ownership, which is a completely legal and valid type of ownership, and that's one thing that we'll continue to look at. And if people have thoughts or ideas, I'm more than happy to collaborate. And then I'll say that there is the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act, which North Carolina is considering right now. So if you feel so led, you can contact your elected officials. And that act offers a lot of protections. It's more protections around the sale of property, which is certainly a big issue, wherein that one heir can sell their ownership to someone, and then that person can force the sale of the entire piece of land. I'm sure people have probably heard about that in the news. It's certainly come up pretty recently, and there was also the Silver Dollar Road documentary, and I think there's another one. But this particular act offers protections and allows other heirs to buy that person out, and for the property to be assessed at its fair market value instead of whatever the highest bidder bids. So that's kind of like an actual policy that's sort of being considered by the state, and a lot of other states have adopted it. So yeah, that's sort of the... and then we're putting together a Know Your Rights thing for heirs property owners, so that they know like what their actual rights are as an owner in heirs property, which I think will likely be helpful for advocates as they work with people to sort of push this in the areas that they work in, so that they know like what they can and can't do under the law.
Awesome. And you kind of answered the part of the last question, so I'll just ask, you know, if people are in this situation involving heirs property, or, you know, they know someone who is, where should they go?
So I'll email you guys over a couple of resources, and then there is also the Heirs Property Practitioner Network, which is legal professionals and advocates working in this space. It's a listserv, but I'll send it over, and you can ask to join the listserv, and they talk about stuff, and it's all across the country. And it can also be helpful if people have specific questions or seeing, you know, specific issues and want to see what other people are doing to address that.
Perfect. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. I know I have so many other questions just from a nerdy standpoint, but also I can imagine we have several other questions from folks as well. Thank you so much, AD, for joining us today, and also congratulations on this work and winning the settlement. I hope that we can maybe have you back sometime and talk a bit further. But yeah,
definitely. If people want to send questions, I'm more than happy to. I know you guys have like a tight schedule, but if people want to send questions or we want to like schedule another time for just that, I'm more than happy to do that. Like you said, I could talk about this on and on. So,
well, we can put whatever contact information you're comfortable with, we'll put it in the call notes for folks so that after they listen to this, they can, or as they're listening, they can follow along with the notes and then also reach out if they have any questions.
That sounds great.
Awesome. Thank you so much, AD.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. So because that great conversation, I think, is really important to hold space for that and is really the highlight of the call today. The only additional updates I'm going to give you all are some state legislative updates. So as you all know, short session resumed on April 24th. We have some links about the bills that are formally eligible to be considered during the remainder of the 2024 session. But I did want to mention some of the bills that we're keeping an eye on. So House Bill 925 is a bill to create a statewide Department of Housing and Community Development. And if you recall how we talk about our framework for solutions and interventions, this is a good example of an infrastructure type of intervention, right? Creating the infrastructure for programs and resources to be able to flow effectively and efficiently and have a better impact. We also are looking at a bill, House Bill 959, that integrates a number of the recommendations from the House Select Committee on Homeowners Associations that we are following. This bill looks at trying to improve HOA accountability and transparency. And finally, there is a technical corrections bill that makes modifications to the fiscal 23 budget, SB 508, Senate Bill 508. It was ratified, but one correction of interest is that it would repeal a provision that was put in the state budget last fall to keep local governments from using zoning to block the development of affordable housing. So I will stop there. We have several local community updates, great things being done, conversions of hotels for emergency housing, different committees hosting public engagement opportunities, particularly around CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant, and the mitigation funding. So we'll have some information about that and resources and events that we want you all to check out. I hope you have a great rest of your week. We will make sure to type up the parts of the conversation and include some contact information and resources from our conversation with AD today, and we'll talk to you next time.